Okay, I guess we're ready to go. So, as my first slide reminds me not to forget, welcome very much to our 25th anniversary party. Obviously, it's a big event, for us, and I think, as you'll see during the course of the morning and then the afternoon, kind of a big deal for science and even society more broadly overall. So, what are we here celebrating? What's the fuss about? Well, 25 years ago, these papers appeared. The one on the top, of course, that iconic image of the paper by Jack Beliveau and many of his colleagues, and you can, see the list there, which was the first, published demonstration of functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the image on the bottom, no less iconic, produced just about the same time as the paper came out, and Ken's paper came out a little later. Ken's first movies, non-contrast-based or endogenous contrast-based functional studies. So 25 years ago was a pretty good year for what was then the NMR Center, now, of course, the Martinos Center. Some pretty important papers came out, but we're really not here, of course, just to celebrate what we did, but I think to stand back and reflect upon, what this has meant. So, how do you measure that? How do you think about the impact of a technology? Well, of course, one thing you can do is, look at, figures like this one. This came from a recent paper, takes us up to 2014, just showing the use of this tool, functional MR, in science. And in fact, I went up, just did a quick PubMed search. I think the number there it is, something like 36,000 papers at this point use this tool. You can see the little figure on the right. I think 4,400 papers a year is at our current pace. And while we might have stopped the exponential phase of the growth, it's still growing nevertheless. The tool is a ubiquitous tool now in science. And if you're in a department of psychology or cognitive neuroscience, or in a clinical department of radiology or a neurosurgeon who uses the tools of imaging, you could no more avoid the use of functional MR than a biology department would avoid the use of a microscope. It has become that ubiquitous. In psychology, if you don't have your own MRI scanner, you're relegated to the second ranks of academic departments. And we see this, of course, around us in Boston. What used to be this unique capability that we had in Charlestown now exists at Harvard and MIT and BU and soon to be Northeastern, which is fantastic, except if you're trying to fill your scan time and pay your court debts back. But it's really a testimony to how important the technology is. But beyond citations, beyond the science, are there broader implications? I mean, there have been a lot of scientific discoveries that have been made over the last 25 years. What other impact can we measure? Well, so just to give you some sense for at least how some people are thinking about MR, I'll draw your attention to this. This came back a few years ago, the cover of The Economist, The Future of Mind Control. And I just love this quote from the article. I'm sure you can read it. Genetics may yet threaten privacy, kill autonomy, make society homogeneous, and gut the concept of human nature. In other words, basically destroy Western civilization. But neuroscience could do all of these things first. And sure enough, what were they referring to in the realm of neuroscience? Were they talking about detailed studies of C. elegans? Probably not. No, what they were talking about was fMRI. Right, the ability of us to basically, peer into the mind, things like, mind reading, lie detection, et cetera, whereas the technology that they were troubled. And of course, they go on to the fact that these tools in brain science, and they were really talking about our tool, is really going to very much the heart of what it means to be human. And that the implications are not just scientific, but really go into philosophy and ethics and many other domains. And of course, in the setting of this article, this was not always something to be welcome. And I'll just give you, one example of something that may cause you some pause for thought. Do a web search for neuromarketing, and you come up with, a dozen different companies, and this slide is a few years old. My guess is there are probably a half a dozen or a dozen more that use tools of fMRI and other brain imaging tools to peer into our minds to basically, tell us whether we're going to like Coke or Pepsi more, and to essentially try to manipulate our minds using, the fact that we're carrying around, several tens of millions of years of evolutionary baggage in terms of how our brains process the environment around us. And now we can see that. And we'll hear more about the kind of broader societal implications in ethics and law as the day goes on. But just so I don't leave us with a completely sour note, again, beyond the science, I want us to understand that there's been some pretty good things that have come from what we've managed to accomplish. And I'll just give one example. I suspect we'll hear more about them from our afternoon speakers. But here's an example in the impact of functional imaging in the law. I don't know if all of you realize this, but it was not so many years ago that children were vulnerable to capital punishment for capital crimes, right? You could execute children in this country. And a Supreme Court ruling not so long ago, the famous Roper case, the Supreme Court basically stated, no, you can't do that. There was a very similar case, Graham in Florida, again, went all the way up to the Supreme Court that held that it's not appropriate to hold children for life without the possibility of parole. And what was the reason for this? What motivated this change in our law to something that I think at least many of us here would consider a step in the right direction? Well, what did Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, have to say? He talked about neuroscience, that the precise neurobiological mechanisms are, of course, growing, that the notion that the brain continues to mature, and particularly that its executive functions continue to mature, was incomplete well through adolescence, that developments in brain science continue to show fundamental differences between juvenile and adult brains, and that the biological basis to support these conclusions supports the fact that children have to be held less culpable, and it's this legal concept of culpability that means that the same punishments wouldn't be appropriate because their brains aren't developed. And if you go look at where this information came from that Justice Kennedy related to, there were a number of briefs filed on behalf of friends of the court, if you will. The one from the most prominent group, the American Psychological Association, which basically talked about research using MR technology that basically allowed us to gain these insights. And the first citation to that was Ken's paper. So Ken, not only do we thank you, but many other people thank you for your contribution. So just kind of keep in mind that what you do does have important implications at many levels for human health, and we'll hear about that, and even more broadly still. And while the implications are always two-edged, there's certainly a very positive edge to it. Okay, so let's get on. I don't want to spend too much time. What's our agenda for the day? We're going to start with a little bit of history, and we're very, very fortunate to have many of the people that helped create that history here to set the stage for that. Then I thought we would have two sessions kind of devoted to how we're using the tool today. The first and the second part of the morning will focus on the basic science applications of the tools, how cognitive neuroscientists, basic neuroscientists are using the tools of functional imaging today to teach us new things about the brain. Then it's time for lunch, time to schmooze. Remember, this is our equivalent of our retreat this year, so I expect conversations and take the time to meet some people that you didn't know. We're very fortunate to have colleagues from the medical area here as well today. Make sure you introduce yourself to them and vice versa. It's a good opportunity, one of the few where we really can have the whole lab together, so let's take advantage of it. The next talk, first one in the afternoon session, will again be focused on applications, but this time the clinical applications. Here I'll have to own up to the fact that I made a tiny little mistake. The time when we scheduled this meeting coincided with the ACNP meeting, the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. That's the big psychiatrists' trade meeting, if you will. But fortunately, Sue Whitfield-Gabriele is going to stand in to talk about the psychiatric application. She's done outstanding work, and we'll just have to tell them that they missed a great event when they come back from their meeting. Finally, in the final session, we have two great speakers who are going to talk about some of these broader implications of the work, try to set the stage for good, for ill, about what we're doing. But again, I think to try to share with you some of the things that I learned when I looked into this, and that's that our work has implications outside the laboratory, and they're going to talk about that. I think that'll be a real highlight of the day, and I know I'm looking forward to it, and I certainly encourage you all to stick around for that. It's going to be great. So this was going to be the program, but I happened to meet one of our grad students, Melissa Haskell, was talking about the event, and she said, you know, if it's going to be a celebration, you have to have a celebration. You have to have a party. So there she is. So thanks to her. After this, we're going to have a little bit of a party reception. Stick around, have some drinks, relax, talk about the day, and remember that this is really a celebration of some great events that happened to our center. And so let's take advantage of that and enjoy the party. So with that, I think I'm ready to introduce our next speaker. We're going to